Oh, and welcome you once again to the Upper Room. In 1995, a movie came out entitled While You Were Sleeping. And I don't know if you've seen it. You don't need to see it, although it's a pretty good movie. It's a lot of fun, and it's kind of a holiday kind of movie. It stars Sandra Bullock. And in this story, if you haven't seen it, I'm going to go ahead and ruin it for you. If you haven't seen it by now, you're probably not going to see it. And she plays this single gal who, from a distance, falls in love with this guy named Peter. She never meets him and really never talks to him, but one day she sees him pushed onto some tracks, and a train is bearing down on those railroad tracks. She finds the gumption to run out and pull him off the tracks just in time. Well, of course, he is then taken to the hospital and he's in a coma. And the fun begins when his family comes to see him. I believe it's Christmas Day, and he's in a coma, and somehow they come under the understanding that she's there because she had saved him and wanted to make sure he was taken care of, that she is his fiance. And she just doesn't have the wherewithal to tell him, I'm not his fiance. And so they're under the impression that she's someone very special in his life, and she's the fiance, and they welcome her into their family. Well, while he's sleeping, while he's in a coma for a few weeks, what happens is not just that she becomes a member of their family, but when he wakes up, he finds out, that's my fiance? I don't remember her. And so obviously they think that he has memory loss, amnesia, as they say. Not only has that happened, but actually she's fallen in love with his brother, Jack. Okay, so that's the summary of that movie that you don't need to see. But while he's sleeping, the idea is all kinds of chaos breaks out and some fun things happen. That is the case in John chapter 11. The guy who's sleeping is not in a coma. We would call him dead for sure. His name is Lazarus. And the entire chapter 11 of John is about this episode where this man Lazarus, you'll find out that he's a friend of Jesus, has died. And while he is sleeping, that's a little foreshadowing about what's going to happen if you've not read John 11. Most of you have. While he's sleeping, all kinds of things are going on. Some fun things, actually, are going on. Fun as we look back 2,000 years anyway. And just as in the movie, the man who plays Peter, that character really isn't the main character. Lazarus is not the main character either in John chapter 11. We've already done kind of part 1 of John 11. We're going to do part 2 today, and then we'll follow up in a couple of weeks with part 3. And we'll just give them distinct titles because something special is going on here, and it is a remarkable thing that Jesus does for so many reasons. We're in this series we're calling The Expression, and I want to read a quote to you that connects us from this series into this story, this event in the life of Jesus. It's from Juan Carlos Ortiz. He was a pastor in Chile, I believe, and he wrote in a book, Cry of the Human Heart, "The living Jesus is a problem in our religious institutions." Now you would think, well, isn't that what our religious institutions are about? No, he says, no, he's a problem. Because if you are having a funeral, a nice funeral, and the dead person starts to move, there goes the funeral. And dear brothers and sisters, Jesus is moving. In other words, in that direction. In the direction of really messing up some nice funerals. He's already done that twice. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But now, in this chapter, something so remarkable takes place. And it comes at the most essential time in the life and ministry of Jesus. We're just a little over a week out. And you're going to see that what happens here in John chapter 11 really speeds up the time frame of Jesus' execution, his crucifixion. Mike Yaconelli, the late Mike Yaconelli, tells the story about one day after a church service, he was talking to an elderly lady who was a widow, and her husband had just recently passed away, and so he's just trying to get to know her a little bit. And she told him that they had been married 40 years, and he said, "I imagine that you miss him dearly." To which he was shocked to hear her say, "Not really." She said, "In fact, in reality, I never really knew him." Can you imagine? After 40 years, the man you lived with or the woman you lived with, you didn't really even know. "So I don't really miss him," is her reply. I thought how appropriate that is for too many of us in the church. You've gone to church for 40 years. I imagine you miss Jesus. Not really. I never really knew Jesus. That might be a corresponding idea. Is it possible to be a part of the local church for 40 years, but you don't really know Jesus? Maybe you've just been doing the thing you've been doing out of habit, and it's a good thing to do. It makes you feel better sometimes, but you don't really know him. That's why we're doing this series, The Expression, because this allows us to know Jesus and know the Father, because he explains the Father. He illustrates who the Father is to us, and it is, again, in knowing the Father and the Son that we have eternal life. So let's get back into John 11. To do that, I want to go back to John 10, and just to remind you, because it's been a while since we taught on John 10, that is the end of Jesus' public ministry, John chapter 10. And at the end of John 10, the Jewish leaders are trying to murder Jesus. They're plotting, and they even picked up stones at one point to murder him, but the time was not right. The Father's time for Jesus to die was very precise, and that wasn't the moment. And so Jesus is more than able to slip away, and he goes with his disciples across the Jordan River back to where John the Baptist had been teaching and baptizing. And because of John the Baptist's work there preparing for the Lamb of God to come, Jesus and his disciples have an amazing ministry there. And actually there at the end of chapter 10 it says many believed in him. So things are going swimmingly, if you will, across the Jordan River. Actually at a place called Bethany, which is ironic because you know that when we get back to John 11, there's another Bethany that comes into play. While they're there, however, a messenger comes, and a messenger comes to tell Jesus, your friend whom you love, Lazarus, is incredibly sick. Remember that word love is phileo. And so that term for love carries with it the connotation of a brotherly affection, a friend, a dear friend. And that's the kind of relationship he had with Lazarus. You'll find out with his sisters as well. Some speculate this might be one of Jesus' best friends. And they lived in Bethany, not the one where he is on the other side of the Jordan River, but the little village that is along the road when one travels from Jericho to Jerusalem. And so many pilgrims will be coming along that road for Passover. And that is a huge detail in this story. We jump to chapter 11, verse 4. When Jesus heard about this, he said, Lazarus' sickness will not end in death. No, it happened for the glory of God, so that the Son of God will receive glory from this. So although Jesus loved Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, he stayed there for the next 2 days. Finally, he said to his disciples, let's go back to Judea. And you might remember that they said, no, they want to kill you. Why would we do that? It's all about timing for Jesus, never about fear. And so he says, we're going to go. You might remember that Thomas said, let's go die with him. You know, I don't know if that was a sarcastic thing or if it was really count me in. We know that none of the disciples will die with Jesus on the crucifixion day. But that's the setting for them to travel back, okay? And you're going to find out that the timing of everything here is essential to understand. It really explains some things about what Jesus is doing. I cannot overstate how important this event is. Again, it takes place a little over a week before he'll be crucified, and what he does sets the table for what must happen. Jesus' popularity after raising Lazarus from the dead spreads like wildfire, again, because so many pilgrims are coming into Jerusalem along that path, and you can see many people experience this resurrection miracle that Jesus performs. Now, this is the last of 7 miracles in the book of John, and it is the most impactful and the most profound miracle he performs. And again, it's all about timing. As a result of this miracle, the Jewish leaders can no longer stand by. They can no longer put up with what's happening. Jesus is becoming so famous, so popular, so well loved. They have to put an end to it, and that's why it's such an important moment in the ministry and life of Jesus and the life of his disciples as well. So again, he's going back to Bethany, the other Bethany, across the Jordan River, down from Jericho, right along the path 2 miles from Jerusalem. And so this event will become well known. Now, I mentioned that Jesus had already raised 2 people from the dead that we know of. One was Jairus' daughter. She was very young, and it appears as though she had just died when he raised her from the dead. The other was the son of a widow in Nain. And it's really the only thing we know about Nain. It was up along the Sea of Galilee on the western side, and it happened during a funeral. I've taken you back to Juan Carlos Ortiz's quote. It happened during a funeral, when he stops the funeral and raises her son from the dead. Okay, now it could be said, and maybe it was said, because this plays into this. It could be said that maybe, just maybe, that young girl, that young man were not actually dead. As they might say in those days, they were only swooning, okay? They didn't have EKGs or EEGs to measure brainwave activity or heart movement and activity. They didn't have any of that. And so maybe some people had said, we're not so sure he actually raised people from the dead. In fact, I bet, if I was a bet man, I would bet that the Jewish leaders might have been saying such a thing. Well, you know, he raised people from the dead. Nah, we've looked into those, and they were only swooning at the time. They weren't really dead. And that plays into this event. Right after 9/11, I think a day or two after 9/11, John MacArthur, the pastor from Southern California, was invited to go back, and it was his first time ever to go back and be on the Larry King show. That was a nationwide show, talk show, and it was a very popular talk show at the time, and a lot of people watched it. And Larry King invited him back. He did not give him any of the questions he would ask him beforehand. He did not prompt him with, think about these things before I interview you. He just sat down, and that camera came in within about 1.5 feet of his face. And Larry King said, after 9/11, what does this mean? Now, it's fairly obvious that Larry King had in mind to grill him about the geopolitical atmosphere, the scene where from the Middle East, Islamic terrorists had attacked America in the worst attack we'd ever had on our own soil. And so most likely he was wanting, from a pastor's point of view, from, what is God doing maybe, what is happening to our country, he wanted those kinds of answers and that kind of information talked about. John MacArthur says that he, again, was not prompted with this, so he just said whatever came to mind, and this is what he blurted out. I want to quote him. He said, "You're going to die, and you're not in charge of when, and you're not in charge of where, and you're not in charge of how." I don't think that's what Larry King wanted to hear, but that's what the Holy Spirit prompted John MacArthur to say. This is what this is about. It's not about Islam. It's not about, all those other things you want to talk about. Here's what you need to know. This is a reminder you are going to die. And you're not in charge of how, when, where. Isn't that profound? That is absolute truth. That cuts through all the other morass, all the other fog, and goes right to the point. And that's the point. John chapter 11, you are going to die. You're not in charge of when and where and how. Neither am I. Now, once you settle that, now we can move into this amazing event. Now, in case you're asking, is that really a biblical idea to just tell people you're going to die? Let me show you a few passages that might confirm in your mind that this is truth that cannot be ignored. Ecclesiastes chapter 8, verse 8, none of us can hold back our spirit from departing. None of us has the power to prevent the day of our death. There is no escaping that obligation, that dark battle. Let's move on to Job 14, verse 1. How frail is humanity? How short is life? How full of trouble? We blossom like a flower and then wither like a passing shadow. We quickly disappear. And then Moses wrote in Psalm 90, verse 10, 70 years are given to us. Some even live to 80. But even the best years are filled with pain and trouble. Soon they disappear and we fly away. Oh, wow. And then finally in the New Testament, Paul writes in 1 Timothy 6, 7, we brought nothing with us when we came into the world, and we can't take anything with us when we leave. Wow, that's pretty depressing scripture, right? So what do? Do we turn to hedonism and just do whatever we feel like doing? It doesn't matter how it affects anybody else. Just soak in as much pleasure as we can, because we're not going to last here very long. Before we get into the text, again, let's be frank about death. Death is a split-second transition. That's what it is. It's not forever in the ground back here. It is not a just cease to exist experience. It is a transition in a split second. A little bit more background before we get into this passage. I know I keep pushing it off, but there's some things you got to know. When it comes to death, those first 72 hours after death are remarkable. The body decomposes so quickly. And I have been with my friend Kelly where he's been embalming a body, and I've seen the deterioration. But we, in our culture today, in the year 2024, but it's been this way for a long time for us, we have found ways to really clean up this process so that nobody really has to experience what death looks like, especially in those first 72 hours. In a way, we've cleaned up that process, but we're talking about 2,000 years ago now, a death, and 2,000 years ago there was no embalming, there were no undertakers or morticians. It was not clean and tidy. Today, someone dies and you just never see their body again until they've been embalmed, most likely, and they've been dressed up like they're going to a dinner party, and but they're lying in a coffin, okay? That's what we experience, right? Makeup, everything, the best suit. That's what we experience. That was not the case 2,000 years ago. Let me clue you in on how different it really was. Because the body began to decompose immediately, the funeral took place immediately. They might wrap the body and put some spices on it to just deal with the smell, because the smell starts very quickly. But that's why they did not wait. When my father passed away, when my dad passed away, we waited 3 months before we did the service. That never happened in the Middle East 2,000 years ago. The funeral was done immediately. And the funeral was such a special time as people would gather around the family, and it lasted 7 days. My dad's service, and I loved the service we did for him, lasted a couple hours. 7 days. They brought in paid mourners, professional mourners. These were usually women who would shriek and scream and wail out loud. But this went on for 7 days. And the mourning process would go 30 days. People would continue to visit the home for a month, okay? That's usually not what we do. We try to minimize that thing, get it done with, try to move on with life, even though those who are closest to the deceased don't move on, but we do our best to move on quickly. They dealt with the death very quickly, and we see this in the passage we have before us. So it's so different than today. So I'm going to beg you to try to place yourself back there, not see this death of Lazarus as we would see it today. A very cleaned up operation and as pleasant as possible. That was not what happened. In fact, in those first days, the day or two before the funeral, that they could make the funeral happen, there was no eating, because that would mean levity. And there was no levity when they were laying a loved one to rest. Again, let me say it one more time. Death is a split-second transition. And that becomes important in what Jesus will do and say in this passage. Okay, so we're finally to our text, and we're going to start our text with a discussion question, but this first section I'm going to call If Only, okay? If you're taking notes, I hope some of you are. If only, all right? The discussion question is this: have you ever used those words or had those thoughts? If only. If you did, what was it about? I imagine you have. All of us seem to have had those thoughts or used those words. If only I had finished school. If only I hadn't taken that job, or I had taken that job. If only I hadn't married him, or if only I'd married her. If only we'd moved. If only. We tend to live if only lives, right? We look back over the past in our lives and go, wow, how would it have turned out if I had, or if this had happened? If only he hadn't gotten sick. If only she hadn't passed away. If only is the life we tend to live, and we're going to see this show up in this passage. So here we go, jumping to John 11, starting in verse 17. When Jesus arrived at Bethany, he was told that Lazarus had already been in the grave for 4 days. Okay. Again, that's an important detail. This was common, and this is why I believe Jesus waited to come. He wanted to make sure that people knew. You may have speculated that the others I raised from the dead weren't really dead. Y'all know Lazarus is dead after 4 days. Jewish people had this belief that the soul hung around the body for 3 days. But after 3 days, because that 72-hour period, it's obvious nothing is going on with the body. It's deteriorated so much, the soul has left. Do you see why Jesus waits? He gets the message, he waits 2 days, then he travels back 4 days. He knew he had fallen asleep, but he wanted, I believe, he wanted to make sure that nobody could ever say, I think the soul was just hanging around and he just kind of, it reinserted itself into the body. Jesus didn't do anything special. There had to be no doubt that what Jesus did was supernatural, could not be explained in human terms. And that brings us to our location. As you know, we love to film in cemeteries. We're back at the Grandview Cemetery, our favorite cemetery actually. But it's not just that we're at the cemetery. We are filming in front of these columbariums. And if you don't know what a columbarium is, they're becoming really popular. It is the place to house the urn or the ashes of an individual. Actually, not the last person that I did a funeral for, but the one before that is actually his ashes are here. And we know others whose ashes are here in these columbariums. Now, the reason I wanted to film in front of these columbariums is that there's a debate that goes on in Christianity, amongst Christians. Well-meaning Christians ask this question. I've been asked so many times I can't remember. Is it okay to cremate a body? Because we're told that we're all going to be raised from the dead. Our bodies will be raised. How can that be done if all that's left are ashes? Well, the obvious first reaction I have is, so what happens to those who are burned to death accidentally? But beyond that, what's really important for you to understand is that, and this event illustrates it so well, is that it is not a problem for Jesus to raise ashes back into a body to life, or back as a body. To believe that God would not be able to bring the ashes together and put it back into a bodily form is to believe that God is just not able to do all things, right? But this debate goes on. It's amazing. Some people feel very strongly about it. My friend Kelly has told me that these columbariums are becoming so popular and that maybe 2 out of 3 people who pass away, their bodies are indeed incinerated and they're just ashes. So more and more it's being accepted, but there are many who don't believe that that's the right thing to do. I would take you back to 4 passages in the Bible. Let me give you all 4 of them to remind you of something really important if you're still wondering about this. Genesis 18:14 is where an angel, and I think it's probably Jesus, comes to Abraham and says, Sarah will have a baby in a year. And Sarah laughs, and the angel says, why is she laughing? Is anything impossible with God? Is anything too difficult for God? Is the question he asks. Again, in Jeremiah chapter 32 and verses 17 and 27, God himself says this, and then Jeremiah says it. Is anything too difficult for God? The inference is, of course it's not. He can do all things. And then Jesus, of course, said in Luke 18:27, what is impossible with man is possible with God. Okay, so to believe that God can't deal with the situation we see behind us is to believe that there are things that he just can't possibly pull off. There's nothing he can't pull off. And that's what we're about to see in this story. He's dead for 4 days. Nothing can be done, Jesus. And Jesus says, really? Is anything impossible with God? Here we go. Now to verse 18. Bethany was only a few miles down the road from Jerusalem, and many of the people had come to console Martha and Mary in their loss. When Martha got word that Jesus was coming, she went to meet him, but Mary stayed in the house. A couple things to note there. Many people came. This tells us they were a prominent family. The people came actually probably from Jerusalem, and they were well known. Many people came, not just a few friends dropped by, many. It was packed. People wanted to console Mary and Martha. And then we see as Jesus approaches, Martha, there's Martha and Mary, Martha runs out to meet him. Okay, by now you probably know that in Luke chapter 10, we've talked about this before, Jesus, probably one of many times, is staying at their home. And remember, who's at his feet? It's Mary. Mary is the introspective one, probably the introvert, the deep thinking, but maybe the melancholy one. Martha, her sister, is banging pans in the kitchen, angry, right, that her sister's not in there. And so much so that she has the gall to come out and tell the Son of God, tell her to get in the kitchen. Do your job. Okay? So now are you surprised that when Jesus arrives, and probably that same messenger runs to them, so Jesus now is just on the outskirts of town, she runs out to meet him. Mary stays in the house. You might remember that when Martha scolds Jesus and says, you should be getting her in here where she belongs. Remember what he says? Martha, Martha. Now, I don't know if your mom ever used your name twice. If she did, you were in trouble, weren't you? So verse 21 says, Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if only you had been here, my brother would not have died. Can you say guilt trip? First, Martha in Luke 10 is scolding him for not doing something. And here we go again. Same thing. She's scolding him for not showing up on time. Oh, but she redeems herself. Watch this. Verse 22, but even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask. Aren't we like Martha? On the one hand, we just feel like scolding God sometimes. Like, why didn't you do this? Why could you have done that? If only, right? We talked about the if only life. That's the life she's in. But now she tiptoes into the reality that God is all powerful. That God is great in the powerful and sovereign, supreme sense. Aren't we like her? We kind of vacillate back and forth, don't we? I want to jump to verse 28. We'll get back to the verses we're skipping, but this is a theme again. As we pick it up in verse 28, then Martha returned to Mary. Okay, so she's going to have a conversation we'll talk about with Jesus, but now she returns and gets Mary. She calls Mary aside from the mourners and told her, the teacher is here and wants to see you. So Mary immediately went to him. Verse 30, Jesus had stayed outside the village at the place where Martha met him. When the people who were at the house consoling Mary saw her leave so hastily, they assumed she was going to Lazarus' grave to weep. So they followed her there. Okay, the house is packed with people, right? They're a prominent family. They have a lot of friends, a lot of family, and they're watching her every move, and she's mourning, and now all of a sudden Martha comes back and whispers something in her ear, and she jumps up and she runs out. They can only assume that she's running to the grave to mourn there, and they want to be a part of that. That's part of consoling her, so they follow her. In God's scheme of things, more witnesses, more people, more testimonies. Isn't that cool? Verse 32 then says, when Mary arrived and saw Jesus, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if only you had been here. Who's she been talking to? She's been talking to her sister, right? That was kind of the common theme. If only he'd been here. And Mary picks it up. Have you ever done that? Has anybody ever influenced you to go, yeah, if only. Why, God? Yes, Lord, if you'd been here, he would not have died. That is belief in his power. Some belief in his power. You could have healed him. But that's where she draws the line. That's where Mary draws the line. You could heal. We know you. We've heard, we've seen you heal people. You could have healed him. No thought as to, but no big deal, right? Because you could raise him from the dead. For her, that's where the line is. My question to you, where's your line? What do you think God is capable of? But where is that line where you go, I don't think God could do that or would do that? That's where Mary is. So that's the if only life that so many of us live. And it's not the life that God has intended for us, but we tend to live there. And at best, like with Martha, we vacillate between if only and but maybe you could do something, Lord. Now I want to break here and transition to the main point. Okay, that's kind of a sub point, but it's there in the text. I want to go to the main point, but to set up the main point, I want to take you back to the Garden of Eden, Genesis chapter 3, verse 4. You know what's going on here. Adam and Eve are being tempted by the serpent. You know what the instructions from God are to them, and so the serpent comes to them to tempt them. And I want to look at that temptation. Now, I have already talked a little bit about what we're about to talk about, but we're coming to the end of 2024. And as I look back over the year, and I don't know if you ever do that, I encourage you to do this, to just say, Lord, what is the main thing you have taught me this year? Is there one thing? This is the one thing that stands out for me, that God has shown I need to pay attention to. So here we are, Genesis chapter 3, verse 4. And the serpent responds after they say, oh, we can do anything. We just can't go to that tree. And the serpent says, you won't die. Because they said, if we do, we die. He says, you won't die. An out and out blatant lie. Okay? Obviously. You won't die, the serpent said. God knows, now pay attention to this. God knows that your eyes will be opened as soon as you eat of that fruit, and you will be like God, knowing both good and evil. You've heard this your whole life. Did you know that packed into that sentence from the serpent are two bold-faced lies that are subtle that we still live with today? You know why God has said you can't eat from that? Because he knows that your eyes will be opened and you'll become like him. There's two lies there. Number one, becoming like God is not a big deal. All you have to do is munch on that fruit and you'll become like God. God is not great. He's not supreme. He's not sovereign. You have that potential. There are some cults that say you will become a God. That's not a very great God if I can become a God, right? Number one, he's not that great. Number two, he's not that good because he's been holding out on you. He knows that you'll become like him and he doesn't want that to happen. He doesn't want the best for you. That's what the serpent is saying. And here we are, thousands and thousands and thousands of years later, and we deal with the same lies, and we don't deal with them very well. I hear people even in the church wondering about the sovereignty and supremacy of God. Is he really all-powerful? So much so that I need not ever be anxious or worry about anything. He's in total charge. And is he really good? Right? Because if God was good, a lot of the stuff going on here would not be happening. He must not be good. The same lies are with us today. When we put our toes into that deceptive pool, we begin to wonder whether God is worth honoring, because he may not be supreme and he may not be good. He may not be great and he may not be good. Now let's go back to when Jesus was speaking with Martha. Okay, and this is really the crux of this entire passage. It's the main point. In verse 23, he's talking to Martha. Okay, this is before Mary has come now. We've gone back in time a little bit. Jesus told her there in verse 23, Martha, your brother will rise again. I've got good news for you. Verse 24, yes, Martha said, he will rise when everyone else rises at the last day. Martha understands the resurrection. I wonder if while she was in the kitchen, she was still listening, even though she was banging some pans, getting frustrated. But over all the times that Jesus stayed at their home, had he explained the resurrection to her? She is an Old Testament believer. I believe in the resurrection. I believe in who you are. And that's what she'll say. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. Not I can be or I could be one who resurrects, or I could give someone life, maybe. I am the resurrection and the life. What is he saying? I am is the fifth of 7 I am statements in the book of John. It is what takes us back to the book of Exodus when Moses asks God in the burning bush, okay, I'll go, but who shall I say sent me? Tell them I am that I am. That's my name. His claim each of these 7 times, I am this, I am that, I am this, is a claim to divinity. He is God. He's saying, I am God. I am the resurrection. The resurrection happens because of who I am. It's what I do. I'm the life. There's no life apart from me. I did not get life from someone else. I am the source of life, is what he's saying. He is God. And so in this section of Scripture, he is saying, I am God, I am great, and I am good. It combats what all humanity has been told for thousands and thousands of years. It goes on in verse 25 to say, anyone who believes, you know that word by now, pistuo, anybody who places their confidence and trust and reliance in me, anyone who believes in me will live even after dying. What does that mean? That is a split-second transition to life, to real life, is what he's saying. You may die, as this earth prescribes what death is, but you will live, and it'll be in a split second. Everyone who lives in me and believes in me will never die permanently, is what he's saying. Do you believe this, Martha? That is the greatest question that needs to be posed to every single one of us. Jesus is the resurrection and the life, and if we believe in him, we put our trust and confidence and reliance on him, we will live even though we may die here. We will live. Do you believe that? That's what he asks her. Now listen to Martha's response in verse 27. Yes, Lord, I have always believed you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one who has come into the world from God. There's the confession. She's an Old Testament saint. She's an Old Testament believer. You know what I mean by that? Those who believed in the coming Messiah are believers. We look back in the coming Messiah, in the having come Messiah, and we are believers. She put her trust in him. Isn't that great stuff? This is Jesus saying, I am God, and I am great. I am all-powerful. I can make it so that you can live forever. Your part is to trust me to do that. I am all-powerful. No matter what the serpent says, no matter what the common lie is, I am that sovereign. I am that great. You need not worry even about death. So that's verse 27. From there, we already covered his interaction with Mary when she comes out. Now we jump down to verse 33, when Jesus saw her weeping and saw the other people wailing with her. Remember, many of them were paid mourners. A deep anger welled up within him, and he was deeply troubled. Where have you put him? He asked them. Wow. This is an interesting word. It's not just he cried or he was a little disturbed. Deep anger. It's the same word of when an angry horse snorts. There's this deep anger that wells up inside of him. There's this passion within Jesus that now comes out, this emotion. You know, the Greeks had a word for their gods, and that was very prevalent in Jesus' day. They had a word for their gods, and the word was apatheo. And the word has been transliterated into English, apathetic. Path is emotion, right? The gods who have pathos, that's passion, and the A in front of it means not, Our gods have no passion. Our gods have no emotion. They do not care, is what they called their gods. Gods that don't lift a finger for us, but we still believe we should worship them. That's not Jesus. Aren't you so grateful that when you look at Jesus, you see God's emotion? And remember, he's the exact representation of the Father. A song a long time ago that I heard in college was entitled, I Wonder If God Cries, and this is the answer. He does. He has emotion. We know that God can be angry. Here Jesus is angry, and then it goes on. Verse 34, they told him, Lord, come and see. Then Jesus wept. The shortest verse in the Bible, verse 35, Jesus wept. Again, that's not just the word he cried or he mourned. This is a very emotional outburst that he can't control. We're going to talk about that in a moment. The people who were standing nearby said how much he loved him. Phileo is the word they used. What a great friendship they had. And they were right. But some said, this man healed a blind man. That is what happened in chapter 10. That's what happened a month or two earlier. This man healed a blind man. See, they were in Jerusalem. They remember hearing about this or seeing it. This man healed a blind man. Couldn't he have kept Lazarus from dying? Is he really great? Is he even good that he didn't care to get here on time? Jesus was still angry as he arrived at the tomb, a cave with a stone rolled across its entrance. Discussion question. What do you make of Jesus' emotion? What is that about? Well, of course, first of all, his emotion probably was about his friendship with Lazarus and Mary and Martha, and his heart went out to them. Isn't it amazing that we serve a God whose heart goes out to us when we are broken? Secondly, however, I think it has a lot to do with the idea of death in general and how it affects us as human beings. That we really see it as a final thing, as something that it's all over, and the impact it has on us was disturbing to him because he knows it's a split-second transition. It is not final. It is not something you need to dread or fear. It's just getting out of the car and walking. It's just a transition thing. And I think that bothers him. It bothers him that we're so stymied. Some people won't even come up to a cemetery for fear that, I may be here someday. Well, yeah, you may. It doesn't really matter whether you're in a columbarium or if your body is placed in the ground. It doesn't really matter. You will die. But we fear it so much that our health is our greatest concern. I will do anything to make sure I don't die. Well, good luck with that, because it's going to happen. And like MacArthur said to Larry King, you're not in charge. When? Where? How? Okay, so that's the second thing. The third thing is, I think it's a cosmic thing. And the cosmic thing that Jesus is angry about is that, in reality, when many do transition out of this life, they will transition into a Christless eternity. And that bothers him. That really bothers him. It angers him. Most of the people in Jerusalem and in Judea and in that whole area did not believe him to be the Messiah. And so most of them, when they would die, would transition into a Christless eternity. We will all be raised from the dead. We will all be given new bodies, but we will all live in one of two places. The question is, where and with whom? And I think it bothers him. I know it bothers him beyond belief that he would do anything, obviously, dying on the cross, taking our sins, to keep us from living eternally apart from him. That's the cosmic part of this that I believe made him so angry. That is a reality because people have believed the lies about him. A lot of people like to say, how could God be good? This is an illustration of his goodness right here, right? That he feels for us. He cares about us so much. He cares about a sparrow when it drops to the ground. He cares about knowing us so well. He knows the number of hair on our head. And many people say, how could a caring God, how could a good God send people to hell? A good God does not send people to hell. A good God does all that within his reasonable limits he can do. And when I say limits, he has chosen to limit himself so we have freedom to choose him. He has decided if we don't want to live eternally with him, we don't have to. He doesn't send us there, we choose it. And I know that's hard for you to hear. If I end up apart from Christ forever, it's because I chose that. Personally, and for most of you that I know, you are choosing Christ, and you will live with him forever because you chose him. You knew that he had chosen you a long time before you choose him. So God is not the heartless God that you've been told that he is. He is incredibly good. And you see this goodness in how Jesus reacts to what's going on here. We pick it up in verse 39, and he says, roll the stone aside. Is this not foreshadowing of what will happen in about a week and a half? Not long. The same thing will happen. The stone will be rolled away. It seems to be foreshadowing to me. But Martha, the dead man's sister, protested, Lord, he's been dead for 4 days. The smell will be terrible. There she is. Martha's vacillating back and forth like we do, right? Now she's back to the temporal, the physical, if I can't touch it, see it, smell it, taste it, I'm afraid of those things. Yeah, back and forth between you have God in your presence and you're worried about the smell. But it does illustrate the fact that there's no doubt he's dead. He's in that tomb and it's going to smell. Let's not embarrass our family here. And so she sways back and forth between incredible trust in him. But he knows that ultimately she does trust him. Verse 40, Jesus responds, didn't I tell you that you would see God's glory if you believe? So they rolled the stone aside. Then Jesus looked up to heaven and said, Father, thank you for hearing me. You always hear me. But I said it out loud for the sake of all these people standing here, so they will believe you sent me. This is about bringing honor to you, Father. Then he shouted, Lazarus, come out! And the dead man came out, his hands and feet bound in grave clothes, his face wrapped in a headcloth, much like Jesus would be buried. Then Jesus says to everyone, unwrap him! It was just, can you imagine being there going, I'm not seeing this. I'm not saying this. And Jesus says, unwrap him. Come on, let him go. There's a New Testament commentator out of Australia, Leon Morris, who wrote, Jesus was never so carried away by the wonder of his miracles that he forgot the needs of the person. Isn't that a great picture of that? I was thinking if I could raise someone from the dead, right now I'd be going, yeah. Did you see what I did? Yeah. Not Jesus. Unwrap him. Come on. He has needs here. Let's take care of him. It's still about caring for Lazarus. This is the last of 7 miracles, but this is the most profound. It is the most impactful miracle because from this moment on, and we'll get to this, but from this moment on, the Jewish leaders have got to deal with him. They can no longer kind of mess around. We should probably kill him. We tried. They must deal with him. He's becoming so popular. They know that this will spread, and they cannot deny what has just happened here. Maybe there were even some Jewish leaders there that day and saw this and said, something's got to be done to stop this. Again, Jesus is saying, I am God. I am great. I am sovereign. Look what I just did. Only the sovereign God who can do anything. Is there anything he can't do? Look at what God has done. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 10, he who descended, Jesus, to earth, is the very one who ascended, went back, he will go back, higher than all the heavens, in order to fill the whole universe. He fills the universe. That's how supreme he is. That's how sovereign he is. Have you forgotten that? Because if I'm in a fit of anxiousness and worry, I definitely have forgotten that he is sovereign. And again, in Colossians 1:16, we've read this many times. Listen to the phrase, all things. You'll hear it 3 times. All things were created through him and for him, and he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Is there anyone more sovereign than Jesus? And yet, we take things into our own hands, and we're like Martha, back and forth, back and forth. Sometimes I trust you. Sometimes you don't understand he's going to smell. You don't get that, do you, Jesus? This is the same Jesus that put 130 million photoreceptors in each one of our eyes. And for every one of those 130 million photoreceptors, there are 100 trillion atoms for each one of those receptors in my eye, in your eye. He's supreme over the universe. He's supreme over your eyeball. And that speaks not just to his greatness, but to his goodness. Okay, so we've seen the if only section of this scripture where most of us live. We've seen Jesus pronounce by what he says and does, I am God, I am great, I am sovereign, and I am good. That is my nature. And so the only thing left for us to understand then is, so what do we do with this? And the answer is glory. Is glory our part? Glorify. We go back to chapter 11, verse 4, when Jesus first heard about Lazarus being sick, and he says, his sickness will not end in death. No, it happened for the glory of God, so that the Son of God will receive glory from this. God will be honored. I will be honored through this illness. Wow. That's a great understanding of life, isn't it? And he does understand it. God will be honored through this. And then we fast forward there to verse 40 again, where he says, didn't I tell you, Martha, that you would see God's glory if you believe? If you'll trust me, you'll see it. Do you trust him enough to see God's glory everywhere? In every way? What is God's glory? Here's some descriptions of it. It is the beauty of his spirit. It's not an aesthetic beauty necessarily or material beauty, but it is the beauty that emanates from his character, from all that he is. Someone else described it this way. The glory of God is the invisible qualities, character, or attributes of God displayed in a visible or knowable way. Have you seen the glory of God on display? Have you not looked at a sunset? Have you not just looked around at what he has done and is doing? If you pay attention, you see his glory. You see his character everywhere. Even though he lets Satan rule this world, his glory shows up. It's undeniable. The evidence is overwhelming that his glory is here. Scripture speaks to that in Psalm 57:11. Be exalted, O God, above the highest heavens. May your glory shine over all the earth. Psalm 19:1. The heavens proclaim the glory of God. The skies display his craftsmanship. We live at such a time where through the Hubble telescope and others, we can see his glory. We can see galaxies. That's the glory of God speaking to us. We have such an advantage over the people that lived in the time of David and even in the time that Jesus lived. Of course, Isaiah chapter 6 is where Isaiah says, I saw the Lord high and lifted up, and he describes it with all the angels, and the 6 wings that each have, and they're flying around the throne, and he says, I am ruined, I'm in trouble, I cannot be in his presence like this. And what are the angels singing? Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of heaven's armies. The whole earth is filled with his glory. Have you noticed? Have you noticed the whole earth is filled with his glory? 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 4, Satan, who is the god of this world, has blinded the minds of those who don't believe. They are unable to see the glorious light of the good news. They don't understand this message about the glory of Christ. That's the message. It's the glory of Christ, who is the exact likeness of God. Again, back to John MacArthur, he says the most important theme in the universe is the glory of God. That's the theme of the universe, the glory of God. Finally, Exodus chapter 33, when Moses says, I want to see you face to face, God. He's been talking with him, interacting with him. He says, I want to see you. Moses responded, show me your glorious presence. I just want to see your glory for my own eyes. The Lord replied, I will make all my goodness pass before you. Do you see what he does? He connects his goodness to his glory. They are inseparable. His character is to be good. He says, I will call out my name, Yahweh, before you, for I will show mercy to anyone I choose. I will show compassion to anyone I choose. I am good, merciful, and compassionate. But you may not look directly at my face, for no one may see me and live. I'm going to have to pass by. You have to see the backside of me, is what he's saying. But he connects his goodness to his glory, and that's it. If you believe in the glory of God, then you must believe in how good he is. No matter what the lies of Satan, which have permeated this world, and to some extent the church, are saying. So let's summarize what Jesus was doing, what he said, and how we are to live. 1 Corinthians 10:31, whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. That's it. That's our purpose. The glory of God is our purpose. It's not to have a certain occupation or make enough money or any of that, to become famous. None of that. It is to give God glory. That is, I can tell you without even talking to you personally, that's your purpose in life, is to give God glory. It's what you and I were created for. I know we have a lot of golfers amongst our house churches, and we talk golf a lot. And boy, these last few years with Scotty Scheffler have been amazing. He just won another tournament, and it was his 9th tournament win in this calendar year. That's unheard of. I mean, it's crazy that he did that. What's interesting is right after he won the tournament, was doing the press conference they're required to do, they are asking him about the purse. You know, how much money have you made? But he said, I don't care about the money. I don't golf for money. And they were all shocked. You don't care about the money? I do not. He says, if we got no money for doing this, I would still do it. They shouldn't have been so surprised. Here's what Scheffler said after winning the 2022 Masters. All I'm trying to do is glorify God. That's why I'm here. That's why I'm in this position. So for me, it's not about a golf score. There you go. All I'm trying to do is glorify God. He is saying what we all should be living. All I'm trying to do is glorify God. That's all that matters. No matter who we're interacting with, what we're doing, what we're saying, it is all for his glory. As Jesus did what he did in John 11, it's just to glorify the Father, and the Son will be glorified. Our character will be known, and you'll know this. I am God. I am great. I'm sovereign. Only the sovereign could do what I just did, and I am good. I truly care for you. So be careful about buying into the mantra of this dying world that says God is not good and he's not great, because he certainly is. Well, I have no doubt that on the day that Jesus returns, behind me, in these shelves behind me where there are just ashes, suddenly bodies will come out, because that's the goodness and greatness of God. These columbariums will not contain what God's about to do. Thanks for joining us. We love doing this journey with you. God bless you all.